Gone with the Wind is a national epic, in a sense, for white Southerners. It enshrines both the Old South myth of elegance and gentility and the myth of the lost cause of the gallant outmanned Confederates fighting to their last against the Yankee invaders.
The Yankees can't fight and we can.
Gone with the Wind has this magical quality to actually alleviate a white Southerner's guilt and make us believe that that is really how it was. You actually think for a second, wow, I wish those days still existed.
War, war, war. This war talk's spoiling all the fun at every party this spring. I get so bored I could scream.
The impact of the Civil War on the South was enormous. In many ways, that history continues to play itself out. And so, in that sense, it certainly isn't over.
Mammy!
White Southerners and black Southerners are attempting to find ways back to one another, to reconcile their different memories, to come to terms with a difficult past.
If you look at the South today, it is not the same South that it was in the years prior to the Civil War. It is not the same South in the immediate years after the Civil War. But those Souths are part of the new South.
Gone with the Wind has captured the imagination of audiences around the world with its vivid depiction of life in the Old South.
The image of the Old South is remarkably durable. So you have this image of, cavaliers, rich, cultured plantation owners.
It conjures up a time of leisure, a time of class, a time of civility, a time when time moves slowly.
I've got an idea. We'll talk about the barbecue the Wilkses are giving over 12 Oaks tomorrow. That's a good idea.
The attraction of the antebellum South is not only for Southerners, but was also for Northerners. Gone with the Wind was immensely popular all over the country. The Old South was something that the rest of the nation was not.
The Old South, as depicted in Gone with the Wind, continues to inform people's perceptions. No matter how hard Atlanta might try to market itself as the new city of the New South, when people come to Atlanta, they come looking for Scarlett O'Hara. They come looking for Rhett Butler. That's the South that they want to see.
Faulkner said in the South, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. It's very easy in many places in the South to feel history very forcefully. History is all around us.
I don't think the South has changed nearly as much as we give it credit for. I say that for good and for bad. They're really, beautiful ideals that still exist in Mississippi, in Georgia. Hospitality. If someone needs something, it is your job as a neighbor or a friend, or just to go see what the inside of their house looks like, to go bring it to them.
I would say the most obvious enduring quality in the South are its beautiful manners. Southerners are the most mannerly people in America.
Southern hospitality is part of your bio, and part of it is being proud of being Southern.
We tend to know our history better. We tend to know who we are, and we're very rooted. Family ties are very important. Those old values of the South still continue, and I think we hold on to them. We're also very friendly people, and we will feed and clothe and give to almost anybody, strangers who come through, whereas in the North, you don't have that kind of thing.
I think there were some times in my life when I was a teenager where I didn't want to have an accent, and I didn't want to be from the South because, people thought that if you had a Southern accent, you were automatically a dumb person or you weren't smart. But somewhere along the way, if you're a Southern woman, you outgrow that and you realize that you're one of the lucky ones.
As an African American in the South, I'm very proud to be a Southerner. And I say that to people about it. They say, well, how can you be proud to be a Southerner? And they had slavery and stuff. I said, but you know what? There were a lot of good ones in there that helped us get from point A to point B. And now we're a family. We tend to get along better than people from other regions, African Americans and white Americans.
Progress in the New South has been hard-won, rising from the ashes of the one historical event that overshadows all others.
It's been 150 years since the Civil War, and it remains a viable historical and cultural force in the lives of Southerners, of black or white.
In the wake of the Civil War, Southerners found themselves in uncharted territory.
As the sun sets on the major combat actions of the Civil War, the South is facing a very different and starker future. The Reconstruction period in the Civil War is going to be one in which you're balancing the attempt to reunite a nation that has elements in it that aren't comfortable with being reunited.
White Southerners wanted to restore the Old South civilization because, of course, everything was destroyed after the war. Slavery was destroyed. In many cases, their land was destroyed. So what they decided to do after the war was reconstruct what they thought was the Old South civilization. And that civilization was based upon white supremacy, on the dominance of white rule.
African Americans are going to try to experience freedom as much as that can be possible in the new setting that exists. And yet, black codes aren't going to be substantially different from slave codes that existed before the war. The fact that you can't just go wherever you want or do whatever you want is quickly going to be the reality for so many people.
Historians are fond of saying that the South lost the war but won the peace.
For white Southerners, the effort to win the peace included the creation of a mythology that would reframe the South's history for future generations.
When you're trying to sort of use the past to justify what you're doing in the present, you're naturally going to try to lay down a good, solid historical foundation that shows that you were a noble civilization from the beginning, populated by admirable people. And so that's a lot of what the Old South myth was really about.
White Southerners created a myth called the Lost Cause. And in this lost cause, they elevated the defeat that they had suffered at the hands of the Yankees in the Civil War into a noble effort.
White Southerners created the myth that the war was not fought over slavery. Now, before the war, white Southerners knew very well the war was fought over slavery. There was no question about why the war was being fought. Everyone knew what the war was being fought over. It's only after their defeat that white Southerners are able to create this prevailing myth that the war was not about slavery at all.
By the first part of the 20th century, it was common to see novels and history books reflecting the Southern perspective on the Civil War. That is, the Civil War was not about slavery. It was about states' rights, and that, in fact, slavery may have been the natural work for African Americans, and even if it weren't, white Southerners were the dominant race, and they, in fact, should rule.
The hardest thing to teach students and get them to really buy into is that the war was about slavery. The first thing you had to do was sort of destroy the Gone with the Wind image of what the Civil War was about, because there's so many people today, not just Southerners either, who want to believe that it was about almost anything else.
But when you get right down to it, it really is slavery. Because what state right are you talking about? You're talking about the right of individuals in the southern states to own slaves. So when you talk about the other issues, whether you're talking about the tariff or states' rights or the economy or postmasters, whatever you're talking about, it all comes down to slavery.
I think it's important to keep in mind that Southerners weren't the only ones who bought into the Old South myth. It also offered Americans at large to sort of escape into this mythological world where everything seemed so perfect and everybody was happy.
The truth of slavery is rarely mentioned in our romantic depictions of the Old South.
The image of the Old South in movies like Gone with the Wind is an image of a plantation society, one based on slavery, but slavery as it's depicted in that image is fairly benign.
Quitting time? Who says it's quitting time? I said it's quitting time. I was the foreman. I was the one says when it's quitting time at terror. Quitting time!
Slavery is really not even a critical issue in the movie. You have these African Americans that are working for these white families, and it's as if it's just their job. It's as if they just get a paycheck, and this is something they chose to do.
There's an element in there that's so seductive, it would have you believe that there could be these rich and powerful people who would never abuse that power, and the subjects who were exploited to create the wealth and sustain the power would never for a second resent it or hold a grudge.
Gone with the Wind also attempts to have it both ways and portray these black people as being happy in the context of slavery. But also they have Ashley saying, I would have freed my slaves once my father died. Well, if they were so happy, why would he want to free them?
Gone with the Wind is a great example of how the white South's view of the antebellum period, the war, the South's view of Reconstruction became really the prevailing national myth. And that's remarkable. There aren't many cases in history where the losers write the history, not the victors.
For Confederate soldiers returning home, however, no myth could obscure the fact that they were the first Americans ever to lose a war. It fell to Southern women to heal their wounded husbands, fathers, and sons.
There was an effort after the war to prop Southern men back up. That they had lost the war was devastating, not just as a society, but as men. A lot of efforts went into kind of bolster a Southern manhood, to tell a story about the war that didn't emphasize the loss, but instead emphasized that Southern men fought hard and fought bravely, and that they fought to protect their wives and families and way of life.
To carry the glory of the Old South forward into the New South required visible tributes to Confederate heroes. Once again, it was Southern women who came to the rescue.
After the war ended, it would have been very, very difficult, in fact, for the vanquished, that is, for the men of the Confederacy, to stand up and say that they wanted to create monuments to what was, in fact, treason. But for Southern women mourning lost husbands, sons, fathers, brothers, to wish to carry on the memory of their loved ones, not only by decorating their graves, for example, annually on Memorial Day, but ultimately also by creating monuments to commemorate that loss, was viewed as apolitical, as less problematic. The women could do something the men could not.
All those statues and monuments are not erected in honor of losers. They're erected in honor of courage and heroism.
Everywhere you turn, there is, in fact, a monument to a Confederate soldier on practically every town square. And it puts off a great many visitors from outside the region to see these statues to people who fought a war to maintain slavery. But that's the reality of the South.
While monuments to the Confederacy have become an accepted part of life in the New South, one symbol generates a great deal more controversy.
When we see the Confederate flag, students get really upset about it and say, why do they still fly it? And I try to tell them from a white standpoint, but see, these people really believed in the Old South. And they really believed that they won the war, and this is their land and their country. And the Northerners were nothing but carpetbaggers and scalawags that came down here. And they still see them that way.
A number of white Southerners believe that, hey, this is my heritage. I deserve to have this flag, and there's no racism about that. But the fact is that the Confederate battle flag from the very beginning was associated with white supremacy. And not only that, but the Confederate battle flag supported a country that was dedicated to the furtherance of slavery.
I remember there was one white American young man there that had this flag up and he had lights on. And I'd heard some of the African Americans saying that, we're gonna get him before he leave town. So I went to him and I said, let me tell you one thing, I don't know you, young man. And he liked me. He said, hey, Dr. Bird, how you doing? He flying the Confederate flag, right? Hey, Dr. Bird, how you doing? And then he says, then I said to him, I said, these young men are plotting against you. Do you realize what that flag means to them? Do you know what the Confederacy was to African Americans? You were trying your best to maintain that institutional slavery. You did not want to give that up as a people. So your flag says that we still don't see you. We still see you as 3/5 of a man. We still see the women as women that we can take whenever we want to. We still think that you should never go into college. You shouldn't have those rights because you're not completely human is the way that they thought of African Americans. And so he heard all that. He said, you may be right, Dr. Bird. So he took him down. But I can tell you, in small town America, those flags fly all the time.
My position is that, yes, this flag should fly, but it should fly in a museum.
The long journey to reconciliation between blacks and whites in the South has had many landmarks, none more pivotal than World War II.
Some historians are fond of saying that World War II had a more dramatic impact on the South than the Civil War did because of the involvement of black World War II veterans who came home to the South and were no longer content to remain in that segregated society. Black Southerners and blacks across this country talked about what they call the double V, the victory at home and the victory abroad. And even white Southerners despised Hitler's racial politics, and even white Southerners understood that things could not remain as they had been, that you could not make war on Hitler and demonize Hitler's racial politics without seeing the obvious similarities at home. And so many Southerners, black and white, understand that change is going to have to come.
But understanding the inevitability of change and embracing it are two different things. In the 1950s and 60s, the conflict between the values of the Old South and the promise of the New South reached a boiling point.
You had the Civil Rights Movement culminating with the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But what did you have in the wake of the Voting Rights Act of '65? You had civil disturbances, you had riots, race riots across urban America. We were trying to find ourselves. What kind of country are we? The Civil Rights Movement captured the imagination of millions.
Most Americans today, most Southerners today, would want to embrace and own the civil rights movement as their history. And I think African Americans are more capable of remembering the degree and extent of white resistance, and also more conscious of the ways in which the civil rights movement is ongoing.
So much of what we do in this country is an attempt to tell ourselves that we are really better human beings than we are. People want to feel good about themselves. And for white people to look honestly at the South and the racism that was permitted by the nation, that would really destroy our concept of ourselves as Americans. You cannot talk about American ideals of democracy and justice and freedom and not acknowledge the fact that in the context of race, each of those ideals is demonstrably false and has been for the majority of our history.
If the Civil War was about the abolition of slavery and about trying to fulfill the noblest aspirations of American society as laid out in documents like the Declaration of Independence, we're still grappling with those issues. Race has not disappeared. What W.B. Du Bois called the problem of the color line continues.
Whites and blacks, of course, in the South today view their history differently, but they also understand, there's increasing understanding, that these histories of black and white intertwine. They intertwine in music, they intertwine in food, so there's a growing acknowledgement of a common history.
We are a resilient people, even as far back as the Civil War, being able to rebuild. And for blacks after the Civil Rights Movement to bounce back and do the kinds of things that they've done over the last 50 years shows a lot of tenacity.
In the recent history of the South, one need only look to the recovery of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina to see that Southern tenacity in action.
The fight that New Orleanians put up to preserve this city and its culture and its heritage has been a real inspiration. There was the real, very real danger that this place would disappear, and there seemed to be a perfect willingness on the part of many people across the country and in the federal government to see that happen. And so the fact that New Orleans is here and the fact that so much of that culture is intact is a huge victory.
The town has come back economically for sure. The sense of joie de vivre in New Orleans is as great now as it was before. But there are pockets of destruction that remain, and life in those pockets has not come back.
There was also the fear that much of what made New Orleans distinctive and much of New Orleans' very real and deeply rooted culture might be erased because so many of those neighborhoods had been destroyed and so many of the city's black population had left and might not be able to return.
After Katrina, after the levee failures, there's really this effort to keep New Orleans culture without New Orleans people. And I don't know if that's possible. If you talk about what makes New Orleans interesting and different and important, the African presence is crucial for that. In the absence of the African presence, New Orleans would not nearly be so compelling as it is.
To see New Orleanians rally around this city, to live in a city where almost every person has made a conscious decision to be here, most of them fighting to be here, I don't know of another city that can make that claim.
Like a good bowl of gumbo, the city of New Orleans brings together disparate elements to make a unified whole.
Society in the South is very much a gumbo. It's a mixture of things, of people from various backgrounds. And together, it makes one mixed society.
The cuisine of New Orleans has played an enormous role in the city's rebirth. For those of us who were here during the storm, we all gravitated and celebrated the minute one of our favorite restaurants reopened. The minute some chef came back into town, it was big news all over the city.
New Orleans cuisine has been one of our emblems for the entirety of our history. It's also one of the ways in which the mix of the African, the European, the Native American, and the Caribbean have come together to define New Orleans. So if you take any of our emblematic dishes, not only are you affirming New Orleans, you're affirming all of the cultures that have come together to build the city and make it great.
The native cuisine here is as strong a cultural factor as it ever was before.
1 week after levee failures, there are a whole lot of New Orleanians in Baton Rouge. And so my dear friend Dawn Logston and her family called together as many of those people as possible to have red beans and rice on the Monday after Katrina struck. There's probably no other city in America that has one dish so emblematic of who we are as a people, that you could serve that and have that in and of itself be an act of patriotism.
Though patriotism means different things to different people, Southerners of all backgrounds look to the future with a sense of hope.
I hope that we continue to carry those Southern ways that we've always had into the next century, and yet at the same time that we grow as a people with this nation to help us become the greatest nation in the world.
The flavor of the South is so rich and so varied. It's the story of history from the earliest days and colonial days and revolution through the Civil War to today. So I hope that the South continues to find a way to reconcile its past with its future.
I'm happy to be living at this point in history. At our ages, we have seen the South change unbelievably, and we are so pleased with those changes. All of us have a lot of work to do, but there's work to be done, and there are people to do the work, and we are very happy to be a part of that.
I think in America, we are becoming more of a colorblind society, and I think it's correct to see the younger generation in that regard.
You know, I've got a 10-year-old, and she's absolutely the most colorblind person I've ever met in my life. You know, she doesn't even say black. She says, oh, she's brown. Oh, she's tan. You know, she's burnt sienna.
If my ancestors could see me now, and realize that whole struggle of almost 400 years of slavery and where we are today, they'd probably say hallelujah and thank you, Lord.
I have to say that it is one of the great honors of my life to be able to address this gathering here today.
When President Obama came, we had 500 men that sat there in the rain, dripping from their hats and everything, and sat strong to receive all of these degrees, from engineering to political science to English to medicine and math.
Nobody cares how tough your upbringing was. Nobody cares if you suffered some discrimination. You have to remember that whatever you've gone through, It pales in comparison to the hardships previous generations endured, and they overcame them. And if they overcame them, you can overcome them too. And that's what I'm asking all of you to do. Keep setting an example for what it means to be a man.
Things will never go back to be the same because we as a race, we've come too far now to go back to that. I carried my grandson back to where I come from, back to my hometown. I carried him to all of the grave sites and all of those things because his grandparents are dead now. I wanted him to know where he come from in terms of us, and they can see where we come from and then where they can go, because everything is in front of them, nothing is behind.